All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk. I'm Eirik Gjerløw, a part of a BeyondPlanck collaboration and the postdoc at the University of Oslo. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we approach the TOD processing more low level. So this talk will be two parts. First, I'm just going to go through what the status was at the release in November, and what kind of outstanding issues we had back then. And then the second part will be more about what we have been doing since the release to address some of these issues. The TOD processing part of the Gibbs loop happens here. So we get data from the instrument, and then the task is to try to process the data given everything else so that it can be ready for map making. Two of the main parts that goes on here has to do with the gain calibration and noise estimation. Those are the two main things I'm going to talk about as well. The LFI TODs, so the Planck instrument scans on great circles on the sky for about an hour each before it readjusts. And each of these hour-long chunks of data are called scans or PIDs. So the full mission is roughly 46,000 such scans per detector. And within a scan, this top panel shows kind of like what a typical data stream might look like. So you see a very slowly varying dipole here and the galactic center, as well as some noise. And estimating this noise is part of what we want to do in the TOD processing. We estimate the noise by assuming it's a sum of white noise and correlated noise. We assume that there is no correlation between PIDs. So once the instrument has readjusted, we assume that those two are independent samples essentially. But for each PID, we fit a noise model, which looks like this. So this is the white noise part, the sigma 0 squared, and then this part is the correlated noise 1/f model essentially. So for each PID we fit three parameters: alpha, FNI, and sigma 0. And then a typical noise spectrum will look something like this, or this is the model that we expect. And then once we have sampled parameters, we can sample also a typical sample of the correlated noise and include that in the further Gibbs loop. When we do that, we get plots that can look like this as a function of PID. You have the various parameters here: alpha, FNI, two versions of sigma 0, and then you get for many of the detectors we get chi-squareds that are very well behaved. But what we also saw back in November was that for some detectors we had this excess of chi-squared per PID, and this was kind of an outstanding issue back then, which we looked a bit further into, and we saw that for some PIDs, if for example here from 30,000 to 32,000, if we included only those PIDs, we saw that there was a slight excess of noise compared to what the model predicted, between 0.1 and 5 hertz roughly. So this, we wanted to look closer into this, and one of the kind of telltale things that we also saw was that for certain detectors, at some point during the mission, at around 20,000, there was this jump or change, very drastic change in noise parameters, accompanied here by change in chi-squared. And so for the November analysis, we basically had to cut out the second part of many of the detectors in 44 gigahertz. But when we plot the spectra of the latter half compared to the first half, we see this in the gray line here is the latter half of the data, and that still has this kind of slight noise excess, whereas the first half doesn't. So it seems as if, or this clued us into where we should keep looking after the release. And we had to conclude that 1 over f didn't seem to be a statistically sufficient model for 30 and 44 gigahertz. The second thing we did at release, that I'm going to talk about, has to do with gain estimation. Basically, we estimate one gain factor per PID, and we estimate those by splitting them into 3 parts and estimating each part independently. So we have a global gain factor here, which is independent of PID and independent of detectors. And then one factor here that is independent of PIDs, but can vary from detector to detector. And then finally, a time-dependent part, which is allowed to vary both between PIDs and detectors. And using this methodology, we were able to recover gain solutions that looked pretty similar to previous initiatives. But there were some outstanding issues here as well. We saw that when we projected the correlated noise onto the sky and looking at the polarization part of those maps, we found these heavy noise stripes. This did not look right to us, and our suspicion was that this could be related to the gain, because there's a quite tight degeneracy between the correlated noise and the gain. So that's something we wanted to work on to figure out. So what have we been doing since November? As Matthew mentioned, we now are starting to dig down into more low-level data. So here's a diagram again of a LFI detector. You have the signal coming in through the feed horn, which is split and coupled with the signal from the reference loads. And then those are propagated through here until they reach the 4 diodes that translate the signal into voltages. And then those voltages are translated to numbers. And then those finally, the 4 data streams are averaged in such a way that we can work with the raw TOD, and that's supposed to be a representation of the signal here. So this is what we've been working with, and now we wanted to look closer into the diode data themselves, like the 4 data streams here. And when we did that, and we split the data in the same way, splitting it before and after this noise jump event that I talked about, and looking at the data from a single diode and only the data from these reference loads. So this is just reference load data. We saw that the data behaved very differently before and after this event. And when we plotted the spectra, we saw that after the event, we had this noise bump is very obvious. And this, again, is still just from the reference load part of the data. And we're looking at it in log space, it looks as if it can be modeled as a Gaussian. So going forward, we want to basically include a Gaussian in the correlated noise model, so as to try to correct for this. So that's the plan for this particular issue. But once we are down in the low level land, we can do other things. As Matthew mentioned, we can also do things with the ADC nonlinearities. Basically, the device that converts between voltages and digital numbers should have a straight linear relation, so that a given voltage gives a number, and that relation is linear. But unfortunately, that's not true. So that means that, and the way that this kind of exhibits itself is that when you plot the voltage versus the white noise of the instrument, you get these dips. This is basically like a telltale ADC nonlinearity thing. And what we want to do now is basically just to try to fit these dips with using a Gaussian parametric model for them. And so far, it seems as if we're getting things that are looking much better. So basically, we want to do this to implement our own ADC correction algorithm into the pipeline. The second thing we can do has to do with the 1 Hz spikes. Basically, on board the instrument, there was a clock, and the clock was not shielded well enough. So that signal from this clock was leaked into the time stream. So that gave rise to these spikes at 1 Hertz. And these spikes can be modeled using templates, but the amplitude of these templates is it's not 100% known. So this is another thing we can incorporate into the Gibbs loop as a whole, the amplitude of these templates per detector. Yeah. The next thing we've been working with has to do with how we smooth the gain. I said that we estimate 1 gain factor per PID, but the gain varies much more slowly than that. So in order to get a better signal-to-noise ratio, we smooth it. And back in November, what we did was smooth it with a boxcar average, just a window going through the whole thing. Since then, we've been looking into whether we can do this in a more better way, and so we have wanted to introduce a model for how the gain behaves. So we have implemented a 1/f model for the gain, just as for the correlated noise, where the data points in this case are the gain estimates per PID, and we consider the whole mission. So we fit a gain covariance matrix per detector, and then apply Wiener filtering to get a smooth solution. And when we do that, we get stuff that looks like this, where the blue line is the Wiener filtered solution, and the red line is the boxcar average that we used before. And as you can see, the blue line here seems to follow the underlying variations in the gain much more closely than the boxcar. So this looks promising to us, and a way that we can kind of verify that this is a better thing has to do with these correlated noise stripes that I talked about, where here I flash between the before and after essentially of the maps. So before, you see these heavy correlated noise stripes in Q and U. Whereas after implementing the Wiener filtering, these noise stripes seems to have vanished. So that's a good sign. The final thing that we want to do is polarization angle sampling. Basically, each detector has a calibrated polarization angle that differs slightly from the true polarization angle, as shown in this paper. You compare it with a source that is well known, and you see that the polarization angle reported by each detector kind of differs. So Simone will talk about this more closely, but basically we want to try to sample this process in the Gibbs loop as well. So to summarize, at release, we had some good agreement with previous initiatives. There were issues remaining, which we have been focusing on since then. There's an excess of noise around 1 Hertz for certain detectors, and it seems to be associated with the reference load signal, and it looks like it can be modeled in logarithmic space as a Gaussian. Once we have gone into low-level data processing, we can do other things like implement ADC corrections and 1 Hertz spike template estimation as part of the pipeline. And using Wiener filtered gain solution seems to have fixed the correlated noise issue. And we are looking forward to what sampling the polarization angles can do, and see Simone's talk for this. So that's it. We again acknowledge support from our supporters, and if you have any questions, now's the time.